we talked about the different aspects of the Shen, but we should also think about how Chinese medicine envisioned the mind functioning. Was to say there were a couple of different levels within our sort of conscious awareness, where we have I guess what we mind, that part that you know, where our thinking is taking place, that's seen as like an upper level, and below that there is our, I guess we could say, subconscious, to borrow a modern term, but it's the part of our mind that houses all of our traits, our habits, our tendencies. And so it's important to realize that Chinese medicine's conception was, every time you have a thought go through the conscious mind, it implants a seed of that tendency back down into this subconscious level. So therefore, it's said that we actually, by whatever we think, we create those tendencies. Therefore, a lot of processes which we might think of is actually getting us free of emotion, Chinese medicine's conception was it's actually practicing and rehearsing that tendency. I always think of an interesting patient who came some years ago, and she had had anger management problems, and had been to her psychologist, who's, you know, through talk therapy and all, they came to the conclusion that the reason for all of this anger was issues she had with her father. He was not supportive and somewhat abusive, and, you know, like that. And so the psychologist recommended to her that she really work to get her anger out, right? And even had her do something as to look through magazines, and if she saw pictures of men in the magazine who reminded her of father, she should take a scissors and cut those pictures as a way of releasing that sensation of anger. She actually got more and more angry. Chinese medicine's view would be, every time she rehearsed that anger, passing it through her conscious mind, the seeds of those tendencies were being implanted in this below conscious level. So, you know, it does become a question, where do all these initial seeds for our tendencies and personality come from? And it's sort of the same issue that we talked about, where the Shen itself comes from. Do we bring them with us from a past life? Are they based on our physical, constitutional nature? Somehow we have certain tendencies. Those then erupt in certain ways of thinking, and then the more we exercise that type of thinking, the more set those tendencies become. Therefore, the tendency of Chinese medicine say we have to begin to reflect on how we want to be and act in that way. And then we implant those types of tendencies, and they override these tendencies that are less desirable for us. So Confucius said about this, the trick to uprooting these seeds is to catch those tendencies as possible before they become very formed thoughts. And how do we do that? There's another aspect of our minds. We have these two levels, a kind of conscious level, a subconscious level. We have an observer, our mind watching itself. People like to call this mindfulness, in a way. And so Confucius said, by watching the workings of your mind and catching tendencies and emotional patterns at a very early stage and not engaging with them, but dismissing them, you actually uproot these seeds of these habit patterns, these tendencies, and so forth. So he said that most people don't have this level of awareness. That's why, you know, the Confucian meditation was not like some kind of Buddhist practice where you're, you know, saying a mantra or focusing on a particular part of the body or watching your breath. The Confucian meditation was self-reflection, looking at how you are. So you should watch your mind and see what tendencies come up, what thoughts you revisit, what feels comfortable to you. There's a lot of Confucian sayings about this, that things that are easy for you to do show that you have done them a lot in the past. You've somehow exercised that tendency. And so this has become then, over the centuries, a sort of the dominant of management for your mind is to watch it and uproot these tendencies at the earliest stage, before it, the minute you give over to really, oh, I should feel this, it's justified, it's circumstantial, it just reinforces itself. So that's the basic conception. And so cultivating this self-reflective nature where you can watch your tendencies and be aware of how you tend to react and all. And so this is, again, back to that thing yesterday about being a clear mirror for patients. Sometimes they need help with starting to get that level of self-awareness. So Andrew asked me a question. He said, how do you sometimes get with a person, maybe they're in denial about what their experience, maybe it's too painful for them to touch that area. How do we begin get that opening? And you know, there's lots of, as I say, first meeting the person in a non-judgmental way, in a relaxed way, not trying to go too far too fast is something I find useful. And I never like to mention the most obvious things right away. You know, I often find it a really useful exercise with patients to see how long I can discuss with them without really discussing their actual chief complaint or why they're there for treatment or something like that. Sometimes that really makes the person open, and you're not dealing with them as this problem, this disease process. This, you know, I recommend, it's a fun, just like I said yesterday, sometimes learning how to put pressure on people and release that pressure is fun to practice in your normal life. Some of you have heard me say this, but I often practice it at the ATM machine. That's a great place to practice pressure and release. Really, you know, because people are always a little bit nervous at the ATM. They don't want anybody to see their PIN number or anything like that. So I always, you know, there's somebody at the ATM, I always go up and I stand too close to them. But I don't look at them. And you can see the disquiet it produces, because they don't want to say anything to me because I'm not looking at them. You know? And then I'll turn and I'll greet them after they step away. And you can see they don't know how to deal with that. You're practicing how much pressure can I put on before they have to say something. You know, confined spaces are really good for Americans particularly. We have a pretty big sense of personal space. We don't like people being too close, you know. So you can practice that. You can get intentionally too close. Like in an elevator, the elevator's empty. There's one other person there, and you stand really close to the person. But again, how can I put pressure and somehow release it by not looking at them or I'll smile. So it's fun to play with that kind of because it makes patience. You get more sensitive about how to you know, put pressure on the person and release the pressure. And the same thing, you encounter a friend, he's got a cast on, you haven't seen him in a while. How long can you talk to him without mentioning the cast? You know, stuff like that. That's sort of the same thing that you can do with the patient, you know. I'm sure you've all experienced with people like, say, somebody was talking about yesterday about dealing with patients who are extremely obese and the like. That's often very good. People come in, they're extremely obese. You get that 500-pound person who sort of manages to squeeze through the treatment room door. How long can you deal with them without talking about that? That's really good practice because they often know, you know, they already know that their knee pain is a result of being so. But if you talk about they're coming in for their knee pain and you're able to talk about that in another way for a while, they become so much more open. And let's not forget, if we're going to do acupuncture, that's when people become very open to suggestion. You get the needles in them. It's like trance induction. Right? It's like you talk about implanting suggestion. I don't want to give people advice or help them recognize who they are sitting across the table. I love it when they're already laying on my treatment table. I'm putting needles in them. Then I start to give information that it just goes right in without resistance. All of their blocks to that go down. So again, though, how to start to open up about difficult areas. I like to ask general questions that are very broad before I ask about very specific things. It gives them a chance to volunteer information. And then you may hear something in that general discussion that you can come back to. I don't jump on it right away. Again, it's that pressure release. It was already enough pressure with the general question to get a slight response. I don't jump on it. I'll go on, talk about something very concrete for a minute, and then go back. Oh, by the way, you mentioned that, what's going on? Or I find it very helpful to sometimes recognize something, mention it to the person, but not go into it then. Say, I want to come back to that at some point. You might find the same thing with patients who are very sensitive about treatment on certain areas of their body. Perhaps they feel very vulnerable if you treat around their neck or throat, or maybe you need to do points on the lower abdomen, or you want to use a point like Ren 1, which the person is very shy about. I often do it by this method of mentioning, there's a point in this area that's very useful for your condition, but I know it's a little strange spot, but it's not sensitive. I actually try to make the issue something else, where they might feel, oh, this is a bit invasive, it's a private area, but I turn it into, oh, if I do it. That already changes their mind's orientation towards it a little bit. And then I'll say, so if you're okay with that, next treatment, we're going to do that. Why next treatment? Because you want the person to be able to move out of your pressure and feel that they've become okay with the choice. Because very often you say, oh, I want to do Ren 1. It's not sensitive. I'll say, oh, well, okay, go ahead. And then they feel uncomfortable about it later. Right? They get up and say, oh, that was a bit weird. That guy did that point, wasn't especially comfortable with him. But if you don't do it in that treatment, they go away from you, and then they come back. And you say, okay, now today we're going to do that area. I need you to lay on your side. I'll put this cover over. They've become outside of your pressure. You've released pressure on them. Now they feel comfortable. So, this is that idea of how to put pressure, take the pressure away. You do it in your questioning, a general question, notice something, but don't jump on it then. Come back to it. You give the release of the pressure. And this is the way I tend to try to work deeper into the person's areas that they're not interested in looking, or not comfortable looking at or dealing with. After all, a lot of that's protection, right? It's too much for them. It's overwhelming for them. Think of a physical aspect of this. How often do you see people come in who are very deficient physically, and yet they're doing very cleansing lifestyle stuff? And they have this idea that I have something inside I need to clean out, whether it's fat or toxins or heavy metals or whatever thing they happen to. That may be true. They may have something but as long as they're deficient, their body can never release that, right? They need to be built up. So the cleansing is not correct at that moment. And the same thing true with emotional constraints. If the person is somewhat deficient, this is what we mentioned yesterday, you have to be careful of points that provoke an emotional release. You have to build the person up, and suddenly they become strong enough to be able to look at issues or to be able to confront situations. Often, if I feel like the person has stuff that they're unwilling to deal with, I go into a mode of tonification with them. Build up the strength of their chi and blood, build up their yin, and then suddenly they're okay. They actually start to volunteer that information. Anyway, so those are some of the thoughts I had when Andrew asked that question, to get people to, along that line of, yesterday we talked about sexual dysfunctions a little bit. This is a very private area for a lot of patients. So again, the ability to deflect, because especially, with men who have, erectile issues and all of that, that's very often to admit to. So if you can shift it away from some kind of performance thing, if you can sort of make it a very physicalized discussion, that's very helpful. So how do we get to enter in? That's where you can have those checklist kind of things on your, I hate these very elaborate intake forms. I don't know about you. It's great for if you're trying to be a supervisor for students or something that forces them to go, organize their thing. But as a practitioner, do you really read those very detailed intake forms? I mean, my God, it's, I'm not doing homeopathy here. Chinese medicine is different than that. I want to kind of recognize, my teacher used to always say, Korean teacher, say, what diagnosis is? Is to catch the nature. He'd always snap his fingers. He said, you have to catch that. He said, so that's people who like spend hours on the pulse. My teacher said, oh, it's just confusing. It gives me a headache, he'd always say, to do that. He said, because it just becomes more confusing. I get more data, more information than I know what to do with. Instead, I'm trying to recognize who this person is. So I have to catch something about their nature, their tendency. So that's what I'm trying to look for. So I don't need this elaborate, like, tell me everything that's happened since you were 1 year old kind of intake. But what I do sometimes like is to have sort of maybe one of those 1 to 5 scales that asks about general areas of a person's life. Like, how's your relationships? Very open, but it might mean something to the person. And if they circle, my relationships are really poor, like they're a 0, that gives me an opening to say, oh, I see that you marked your relationships aren't good. That was pressure. We'll talk about that later. That's release. I don't jump on it right away. Oh, tell me about your relationship. No, on second thought, they're fine. You know, that's the response you get. I'm going to notice that, acknowledge it, and take the pressure away from the person. I always have one of those about sexual functioning too. Something rate your sex life, and sometimes you can put a little line there that just if they have any comment, and people will write none or sexually active or something like that. And again, it just gives you an opening at some point, especially you've already begun treating the person, they've opened up enough to allow you to stick needles in them, for goodness sake, and then you can say, oh, I noticed on the form that you're not sexually active. Is that just because you're not in a relationship, or is there some difficulty there? Are you feeling pain, or, and again, I shift it to the physical for a moment if I can, like, is there some pain issue? And then the person often feels like, there's a safe opening for me to begin to volunteer more information. So that's just, again, these are just the ways that suit my nature. You have to find what suits your nature. You know what I have? Practice management classes that tell you how to be so that you have more patience. Because they always tell you stuff that I know if I would do them, I would have no patience. Because they start talking about stuff about how to dress and how to call the patients back and blah. And I'm like, no, you should be talking about how to be honest, be who you are, so that people like being around you, right? We said yesterday, the sign that your Shen is being developed through expending your Jing in a proper way is that people spontaneously like to be around you, right? And I think that happens when you're really comfortable with yourself. Andrew reminded me, you can't wear blue jeans or anything and come in the club. I'm like, oh my God, let me find some pants. And so, usually I turn up for years, turn up in my clinic, and I'm the kind of guy who likes costumes. I'm always dressed either like a cowboy or like some medieval thing or whatever, It's kind of like, I get stopped a lot. Unfortunately, I live in Nashville now. It's pretty far out enough that I can do it. Because I get stopped in the store. People say, oh, is there an event going on? And I'm like, what are you talking about? They think I'm dressed up for some event, And I'm like, no, I just, event. Oh, then I get it. Then everyone, okay. No, I'm just, that's just me. I like, you could see it. My daughter is into costume design, so. And my son, he only likes normal things. Yeah, he likes to wear normal clothes, not like that. It's too far out. But that's my nature. So often my patients would come in, and usually it's an elderly lady or something. She'd come in and say, my friend referred me in, and she told me that you would be a little odd when I met you, but that you were really nice. I often heard that, but you were really nice, so it was okay. How was I really nice? I was always comfortable with myself. That's important. I worked with so many students through the years, and some students, they may not have been the most academically developed, they may not have known, but and other people, they couldn't build a practice that saved their life. And why was it? Because they weren't nice to be around. That strikes me as so you have to find the way that you can interact with people. I give my suggestions, and you can sort of model on that if you feel like, oh, I'm kind of like him, that resonates with me. But The point is, I think you have to be really honest with who you are, be very present. My patients always say to me, oh, you're always so relaxed. Oh, you're never in a hurry. I am not always relaxed. In fact, I wouldn't categorize myself as a very relaxed person. And often, I was, my clinical practice, a typical 4 people an hour kind of practice, So I was usually running a little bit behind. So I was always in a hurry. But it was not my job to convey that hurry to the patient. I actually practiced physical techniques so that they didn't feel I was in a hurry. I would always sit down as I began to talk to them in a very deliberate way. I was relaxed. And I'd breathe big. They felt like, oh, I never stood there with my hand on the door or something, even though I really felt that in the back of my mind. I know that people were waiting. I can't communicate that to them. So they'd always say, oh, you're always in a good mood. You're not stressed out. You're never in a hurry. Great. That's the person I needed to be at that moment, And actually, it's therapy for you, because if you're in a hurry, but you breathe and you sit comfortably for a minute, doesn't affect your chi so much, Doesn't agitate you so much. And I say I treat, I really think, I know we're going a little afield here for a minute, but I really think that when we treat the patient, I said they're very open to us and our suggestibility. I think that we are maintaining some kind of connection with that person while the treatment is going on, and we don't necessarily need to talk to them. In fact, I think for our American patients, that's actually counterproductive a lot of the time. Over-talk therapy, concentrating on their issues. I want their chi to regulate, that horse to start moving better. Then the mind is more relaxed and moving. The rider can go along for that little ride. So I usually would be treating 4 people in an hour and whatever. And then I'd have needles in these patients, and I'd be sitting there reading the newspaper. And others would come into the clinic and say, oh, you're not busy. And I'm like, no, I'm really busy right now. I actually have connection. The 4 people going on, right? The newspaper were almost an excuse. In fact, the newspaper was, I'm like looking for things I might talk, or sometimes I go on the internet, because I like to talk to people about what their interests are. I find that's a very helpful, for me, rapport building strategy. I never wanted to talk about their disease for too long, but I always wanted to talk about what their interests are, what they like. I always ask people what they do for fun. They usually say they don't know because they never do anything for fun. That's a big problem right off, isn't it? You always hear that. Fun, and they're like, fun. Having fun is qigong. Doing stuff you hate to do, I don't care how much Dao Yin you're doing, and I'm moving in a certain way, and I don't think that moves your chi very well. If you think this is boring, stupid, slow, dull, I don't like it, what chi motion happens in that? Better off you play tennis or something. That's better for you if you can't find the comfort and relaxation in this special technique. So and again, my practice was skewed. I had a lot of kids, and I had a lot of old people. Some athletes, and so like old ladies would come in. They'd say, "Oh, what I do for fun is I'm a quilter." Okay, I go online, look up quilting. I come back in, I start talking to them. Oh, do you do this pattern or that? Oh, they become so happy. Oh, they incredible. They're talking. Man, that chi really is regulating that, right? Then the little point really makes a difference. But the mind is blocked. How can I move that with that subtle needling technique, So, but I'm really feeling the person. So, there's a kind of qigong where you diagnose the person by feeling their chi movement in your own body. But that was very natural for me. I don't think it's because some special ability. It's just, I like that. I don't see their chi so much looking at it. I don't try to feel it at a distance with my hand. I feel it inside. Maybe that's a technique you might like. For example, you put the needle in, you're trying to find the chi. And you can't get a reaction like you would like. I always shift my concentration from their point to my same point. And then I kind of feel, oh, where's the chi there? Oh, find their chi because I have a receptor for it somehow. I'm sensitive to that. That's a method that works for me. I suggest that if you haven't tried that, you're trying to get the chi sensation on a point. Concentrate on your point, your body, not theirs. Use your body as the instrument. Otherwise, you're just blindly looking for it. You know? I feel it. Oh, I got large intestinal leavening on them. Where is, oh, there. I feel it there. Bang. Then they get that chi response. You know? So I'm in resonance like that. If I can do it right there, I can do it in the next room too. I'm sitting there. You could tell, oh, they're not comfortable now. I better check on them. Oh, it feels like the needles are long enough for them. All that timer is running inside of them because that connection. So I think there's this subtle level always going on in your interaction with the patient. And I have never from that found that it somehow deranges my chi so that I take on the person's sickness. People worry about that. And then they develop all of these behaviors to try to prevent the chi from, they have to wave their hands in dramatic ways or wash in cold water and all this and that because they want to get rid of the bad chi from the patient. I think that means you have some block inside. You're like fixated somewhere. You're blocking your own chi, in my opinion, if that happens. Because my chi moves when I put my mind. So I treat the patient, I'm in connection with them, I'm done with the treatment, I'm done with them. I got to go to the next patient. Being busy really helps that. I think busy practitioners never take on bad chi from their patients. It's always somebody who's got, 2 people in the day, and they're stuck with that patient in their mind then from then on, and somehow their chi gets blocked. If waving your hands can dissipate bad chi, changing your mind can do it too, in my opinion. So that's where I think this is that Shen leading the chi. The Shen is the rider can drive. So those are some thoughts I have about this practitioner-patient interaction. Anyhow, so we have this little pattern of how the mind works. And one thing we want to work on is helping the person to develop this sort of self-awareness where they're watching their mind. So that leads us to the something that came up yesterday, and I said I tell my little funny story that I always like to talk about, the types of people. A few of you mentioned to me yesterday the notion of constitutional therapy. There's been a political shift. You're moving to the left. And there are many ways of defining a person. Constitutional therapy is the recognition that people do have tendencies, long-term patterns. How many of you have noticed the phenomena with your acupuncture treatments that a patient who comes in for a particular disorder, some specific complaint, and you treat that and it works really well, that if they come in at some time removed from that, a year later even, for a different complaint, if you do the old treatment, it works for that new complaint, even though your intent that first time was to treat this very specific issue of headache, back pain, whatever symptom it was, somehow the fact that it worked really well means that you touched on a pattern that really moved something about their general dynamic of chi. You somehow hit their constitution. So this recognition that there are certain, in the Korean tradition, there was a very famous Korean practitioner, Gemma Lee was his name. And Gemma Lee actually compiled a lot of the classical texts from China into the Korean language, and he wrote a book in Korean, the Dongyu Bogam. And the Dongyu Bogam is like the Korean Neijing, in a sense. It's all these classical texts compiled, and it has a lot of other Korean folk medicine in it and stuff, And but anyway, Gemma Lee noticed that he would diagnose patients, and he would come up with what he thought was the correct approach, and for some people it would work well, and other people it didn't. And he started to find that he'd say, it doesn't seem that I'm diagnosing wrong. People have certain tendencies that a treatment doesn't work as well for them as it does for another type of person. And this is what led him to begin the idea of constitutional therapy. And that became very prominent in Korean traditional medicine. And initially, Gemma Lee started with very complicated constitutional therapies starting at the Neijing, there's a system of 25 types. The five phases with 5 types in each of them, and they named the subtypes in each one according to the 5 notes of the musical scale. So it's very elaborate. I mean, in fact, there was even an older system that had one constitutional type for each of the grams, of the I Ching. So that's even more cumbersome, But then over time, they kept simplifying and reducing the number of types. In fact, they finally came down to the thought that there could be just one constitutional type, the human type. And this gave rise to a lot of attempts to have a treatment that fixed everything. So in my Korean family tradition, there is a point prescription called the Dao treatment that is said to cure everybody for everything. I never teach that at the beginning of a seminar because then everybody feels like they can leave, since they have the one treatment that works for everything. It's all, but we can at some point today, the Dao treatment. But it's a natural extension of constitutional thinking that you can reduce the number of types of people looking at the general tendencies until the fact that you see all humans have a certain general tendency. Certain things tend to get excess, certain things tend to get deficient, certain places we get stagnation, and recognizing that if we just treat that, we'll always restore the normal chi mechanism of the body and the person will balance. This is the idea, though, of constitutional therapy. I like to use slightly more complex method than the one type, which is the 4 types. And this is based on the notion that we have, and so it's really is, as you'll see, very similar to 5 element typing. But the 4 types are the greater yang, the greater yin, the lesser yang, the lesser yin. In fact, in the Korean tradition, they actually have a method where you don't even have to talk to the person. You can just use a tape measure and measure their body and classify them as one of these types or the other. But I think you can just recognize the types. And it tells you something about how to orient your treatment. The greater yang person, they are characterized by generalized excess. Therefore, they have a certain way of relating to the world. They relate by domination, in a sense. They want to be in charge. They want to tell everybody what to do. They like to be in front. They like to be noticed. And they tend to deny symptoms as far as disease process goes. They're the kind of patient that you only see in your clinic when someone else makes them come. I was joking about this yesterday, that there's that certain type of patient that gets drug into your clinic by a friend or a significant other. And when you talk to them, they're almost at first like, I don't know why I'm here. I'm really fine. Even though their arm is chopped off, blood is squirting out, and you say, well, how about that? And they say, it's nothing. Yeah, it's a flesh wound, right? It's not significant to me. And then you find out, in fact, they have a lot of digestive disorders. They have a lot of gastric reflux. They're living on Tums and Rolaids because they have all that excess accumulated stuff, but they don't allow it to obstruct them in their life. Because they have a lot of excess, especially it's then generating heat and yang in their body. These people tend to have a somewhat reddish complexion. They tend to have a somewhat solid build. They're often a bit overweight, but they're not flabby. They tend to, I'm sure you know this person. It's a very common type. And I like this person to run my company. They're really good starters. They're terrible detail people. They're not finishers, but they always have new ideas. They want to start things. It's like everything's no problem for them. We'll take care of that later, right? And so this type of person goes along at a very high level of activity and then suddenly drops dead. They have a stroke, a heart attack, something, boom. Because it takes a lot of chi to die quickly. For yin and yang to separate dramatically, you have to have excess there. You don't, So when we recognize this patient, we have to deal with them in a certain way. They're denying symptoms. So we have to, probe a little deeper, look, they're asking very pointed questions about how their digestion is and how their sleep is and all that, because they're not going to volunteer the information. You want to talk to this person about their diet, you got to ask them what they ate yesterday. They often call that the 24-hour food recall, right? What did you eat for breakfast yesterday? Because if you ask them about diet, they shrug and go, I eat normal food, right? They don't relate to that. So can you relate to this person? Oh, I'm going to put you on this very detailed food regime. They think you're crazy, right? This person, diet, they tend to like alcohol. So you say, oh, you should eat salad. They say, oh, that's rabbit food, right? That's their. So if they exert their force enough to do it, that makes them unhappy. Again, our idea of changing their nature so they change their behavior. We've got to start, our job in dealing with this person is to reduce some of their excess and heat so that they can actually go along for a longer time and they won't suddenly drop dead. So we see this kind of person, we know my general orientation to you is going to be some kind of clearing treatment. It's not unusual for this person to be constipated. Right? So you've got to drain heat, you can say sedation of some kind, and they're able to then go along in a more relaxed way. Their blood pressure comes down, their cholesterol goes down. That's because, so you have to, that orients your general treatment to them. Compare that to when you encounter the greater yin type. The greater yin type is excess as well, but because they are yin, they are excess through accumulation. We would characterize their condition as one of accumulation. They get fluids, stagnation of phlegm, they have all kinds of, they can get stagnations of physical types like cysts and tumors. This more yellowish complexion, they tend to be, rather than solid built, they're the more flabby. They often say things like, I went on a fasting retreat and gained weight, right? Because they don't transform, they accumulate. If anything, we would say they have a little tendency to cheat efficiency, but then they have all that accumulation underneath of it. And what characterizes them in their life orientation is they're stuck. That accumulation physically shows up mentally as well. They can't see the way to make change. We often say that part of being a healer is sales. Selling the person on the idea that you can be healthier, you can make changes in your life, you can be happier. A lot of psychologists have very refined words and descriptions for this, but I think it's sales. It's making the person entertain the possibility of something. Right? And so this person has a lot of trouble with that because they can't see, they're the ones who tell you, I'm in a terrible relationship. Oh, really? How long have you been married? 40 years. Oh, I hate my work. Really? How long have you been doing it? 50 years. It's like that. I just wish I could do this. I wish I could do, but they can't find the way. So a big part of our job in interacting with them is to help them strategize, implement change, and make movement occur in their circumstance. And then, of course, our physical treatment is all about creating movement. We're moving, circulating fluids, we're getting blood to move, we're actually creating that kind of, that's how we have to engage the greater yin person. Now, this person has a lot of positive attributes. They'll stick with it because of that stagnant tendency. So the greater yang person doesn't like details, the greater yin person is great at details. Those two should work together. The greater yang person has this idea, start something, the greater yin person will stay there, get the job done, fill out all the forms, deal with the government, whatever it is, no matter how dull, how boring, it's their nature. They're not going to let stuff go. Then let's compare those two types, which are very excess, to the last type here, the so-called lesser yin type. They're characterized by deficiency. Generalized deficiency. This makes them really sensitive. So they feel everything. Everything knocks them off. So we see a lot of these patients in our practice. They really, biomedicine really misses the mark with these people. Because biomedicine tends to be fairly aggressive in its approach, using pharmacological substances that are very refined, produce side effects. So if the people has 30 side effects for a medicine, this person gets 40 side effects at half the normal dose. And then the Western doctor's like, I think they're crazy, so I'm going to refer them to acupuncture because those people are crazy too, so they deserve each other, right? So we see all those patients. Often we get them on referral. I tell you, you want to get a lot of referrals from MDs. You start talking to them about these types of patients and tell them, oh, Chinese medicine works really well with patients who are hypersensitive to meds and get a lot of side effects. They start smiling. They're like, even if they don't believe Chinese medicine at all, they don't care. They hear you want to deal with those patients, they're sending them to you. They're so ecstatic to get those patients out of their practice, right? Because they don't know what to do with them. So this person, of course, we have to be careful too. You give them herbs, they herbs. You start very mild, very general. You give them diet change. They're going to tell you, whatever you told them to eat, no matter what, they threw up, or they got upset. It caused a negative reaction somehow in them. This is where we see a lot of practitioners get into trouble because these patients, again, they're so sensitive, they feel everything. They get on this very restrictive diet, a kind of a diet where the food has not much chi in it, so it doesn't upset them very much. They like to eat a little bit of fruit. They say, oh, I'm on the sproutarian diet, and I count the number of sprouts I eat. It's honest, right? You know this patient. Used to be the days when they had the roll paper on your dot matrix printer was perfect. Their symptoms on a scroll and unfurl it as they came into your practice and read this big list to you, right? This person, by the way, never dies suddenly, even though they paint a very dramatic picture, because they don't have the chi to die. I always joke about this patient that you wish they died because they keep calling you, but they never, don't worry, they won't, because right? So our approach to this kind of patient has to be, I don't care if they're complaining of pain, fibromyalgia, joint pains, all that stuff, very characteristic of this person, right? Has that you can't be aggressive, moving the stagnation stuff, because you recognize this is that really Lesserian type. Slow tonification is the approach that you have to take with them. Nothing, exercise, they benefit from exercise, but you have to give them ridiculous regimes of like, you're going to start out at 3 minutes a day of brisk walking or something. And you have to tell them, I don't want you walking a minute more than that. Because they'll try, and then they'll come back and say, I was sore, I was more tired, I'll never walk again. You know? Right? So you have to put those limits so that right? You see who you're dealing with. This person tends to be pale, by the way. You know, they're not, yes, hypochondriac maybe, but more like they're so sensitive, so vulnerable. They just feel everything. The greater yang guy cuts it to work. The lesser yin person has a hangnail. Oh, I had to miss work 3 days. It was just too much for me. You know, I couldn't concentrate. No way, that pain in my finger. Oh my God. You know, that's their nature, right? And then why did I skip the lesser yang type? Because that's what I do in my clinic. I guess the kind of person I'm dealing with, just because as we begin to talk to them, it's easy to recognize these types pretty much. And I always save the type I think they are till last. And then I'm telling, and usually I don't like to accuse people of being certain things. I tell them stories. That's another thing that works for me. I like to be a storyteller. So I tell patients stories. I'm treating them. And I say, Chinese medicine has this really basically 4 types of people. I'm just telling them some, information. I'm not telling them who they are. And I'm putting the needles in and I'm saying, yeah, we got this type, the greater yang type. He's like this, and we have this. And that's another part of healing, right? You want a person to sort of have an understanding of how disease occurs in our model. Because having that, I find the Chinese medicine model people can really relate to. Modern medicine, I think, has failed people a lot because disease sort of happens for no reason. It's just, so basically modern medicine says everything that happens to you just because of some inherited tendency. That's the only, but we say there's diet, there's lifestyle, there's climate conditions, there's all of these things have impacts on trying to regulate in the face that people start to feel it's just not random anymore. And that really helps them in this sales thing of making them feel change is possible. So I like them to have some understanding. So I'm giving them some understanding here. There's this type of person, there's that type of person. I'm never telling them how acupuncture works. People ask that question. They don't want to know that. Most people. They don't want to know, well, I put the needle in and it's this wood point and the wood is the mother. Oh, yeah. I see practitioners describe like that. It's just, what they're really asking you when they say, how does acupuncture work? Is it reasonable for me to do this? Can it help me? That's what they're really asking. So I usually go, I have a funny response. Patients say, does acupuncture work? I always say, how does acupuncture work? I always say, oh, it works really well. That's how it works. Oh, for you, it's going to work really well. They usually laugh when you say that. But then often, that's enough, though. They don't even want you then to explain in detail. But I want them to understand something here about themselves. I'm trying to be a mirror, so I'm telling this story. The reason I say lesser yang in this group setting to last is because this is the kind of people that come to these lectures. Most of you fall into this category. So I save it for last because what happens to the patient, they start to recognize, you see them, I'm not accusing them, oh, you're this type of person, you're doing this. Especially lesser yang people will say, no, I'm not. But if they recognize it themselves, well, that sounds like me. Oh, yeah, because lesser yang person tends to have enough qi, enough yang, but not enough yin. Unlike the greater yang person who has a lot of yin, therefore they go along for a long time before they suddenly drop dead. The lesser yang person, because they have a lot of qi, but not as much yin, they get overactive mentally. So they like to study things, they like new ideas, they're going to a lecture, even in our culture, the very fact that we would study a kind of alternative approach to medicine represents some lesser yang activity. There's an appeal that it's different, it's extreme, it's a new insight. Wow, lesser yang people love that stuff. So, and then we think, oh, I can come to this lecture and, even though I'll still fit my exercise in, I'll get up a little early and do it, or and then I'll rush back on Monday morning and see some patients, or that's characteristic of the lesser yang way of thinking. Always you want to do a lot, you feel like you can, and then you end up either overtired, get sick like an external evil, or you injure yourself some way, and then you're off for a bit, and then you recover, and then you take on too much again. So the lesser yang's tendency is this a little more up and down. Physically, to be somewhat more wiry. They like exercise. They develop muscles pretty easily. They don't get so, you're not going to see a 300-pound lesser yang person. It just doesn't happen. If they gain weight some, it's a little, they get a little, a lot of these lesser yang types, they actually have a belly and they're still doing exercise. They're still active. They don't, it's not like the greater yin person who's just so dense and so heavy. So our characteristic is a little bit of yin deficiency. And for most lesser yang people, the yin deficiency is actually, we would say, yin qi level. It actually goes to what we mentioned yesterday, the guy that treats the earth first mentality, called yin fire. We get a lot of yin fire, which we'll talk about in more detail. And by the way, this becomes very important. Yesterday we mentioned post-traumatic stress. A lot of the guys you see with post-traumatic stress fit into this yin fire pattern. It's not surprising. We see so much of that with guys who are in the military. The kind of person drawn to military service often tends to be lesser yang. They like activity, they like action, they want to do something positive. They don't shy away from the physical nature of doing military training. That would be characteristic. A lesser yang person would be drawn in. So, by the way, their complexion is a little bit green. They may have a tendency to get a little bit irritable. You can see how the 5-phase types sort of overlap here a little bit. So, lesser yang people, we've got to recognize that sometimes taking a break is a good thing. sometimes making space is a good thing in your life. I often, lesser yang people say, oh, I'm really tired, I've been working too hard, I'm going to go on vacation. So they go on some kind of really strenuous vacation and come back more tired than when they left. Right? It's just, oh, I'm going to go study that, I'm going to go do this, I'm going to go mountain climbing, it gives a mental break, but right there, they say, oh, thank God I'm back at work, I can rest up, you know? That's a characteristic of lesser yang.
Do you fit in that category yourself?
Yeah, that's exactly me. Okay. Yeah, I said that yesterday. I sort of set this up, but yesterday said how I always think that what validates me is the more I do. And you know, it's not, again, the more I can develop this watchful eye, the more I can moderate these tendencies.
So if they're not quite clear cut, you know, meaning they could be kind of some of both, obviously.
Yeah, but really I think you will see people tend to operate out of one of these positions a lot. Even though, you know, their body type might be a little mixed or whatever, you'll see a certain nature that orients how you want to. This person, lesser yang, they often come in, they want chi tonics, they want stimulant kind of treatment, and you really think, you know, I really should do yin tonics for them. I really should do calming treatment. Because you can see that sort of yin fire phenomenon that's going on for them. Right? So recognizing who the person is, orienting your treatment a little in that direction can be so helpful. As I say, I fit this type. People ask me to come and lecture and stuff. I'm always like, I can squeeze it in. Okay, no problem. That may not always be the most reasonable choice. You know, if I could. Why? The problem is people always ask me in a long time, and so I never. Oh, you want me to come next year? Oh, no problem. I'll squeeze that in. Doesn't seem real somehow. And then next year comes, and it's like, oh my God, I said yes to all those things. What was I thinking? You know how? You know, the greater yin person would never do that. I mean, we don't have any greater yin people in this lecture, I'm sure, because they would want, even if they wanted to come, they couldn't figure out how to get it into their life. Oh, who's going to take care of the kids? Oh, how am I going to travel there? Oh, what, you know, they're stuck. That's why they often say, oh, I really would like to make a change. I want to study something, but I can't figure out how to get the school arranged and all. And that's where your strategizing helps them. The greater yang person is not, maybe some are here, but most greater yang people say, oh, I don't need to study that. I'll read a little bit in a book about it. I'm gonna run the business of the clinic anyway. I'll just hire some practitioners to work there. So I don't need to know all these details, you know. So I'm gonna start a big, you know, mental health program using Chinese medicine, and then I'll hire a bunch of acupuncturists, you know, to work cheap for me. That's the greater yang type thinking, you know. Lesser yang person says, I don't really want to run the business. I want to know all the details about how to treat the person, which is a syndrome. You know, I'm going to study some more herb formulas. That's lesser yang thinking, right? So you can see the difference. Anyway, this gives us a sense of general types of people, and if we recognize who this is we're dealing with, we treat them a little differently, and we share with them some recognition about this. I've often had over the years patients say to me, you know, that story you told me really helped me because I started to make some changes. I took on less, or I tried to make, like the greater yin people will often be so helped by your strategizing with them about how to implement change. They'll come back at a removed date, and you might just bump into them on the street, and they'll say, you know, I went home and did some of those things you said, and man, my life was so much better. So, and it's so, you know, it seems so simple in a way, but it's part of this getting the eye to recognize the general tendency, general pattern. As I say, you're catching something about the nature of the person. My teacher used to say, Dr. Su, my old Korean mentor, would say, you know, diagnosis is not about coming up with what the person really has. Diagnosis is about recognizing where there's vulnerability to your input. So it's not like the person is really the diagnosis. That's just a way that you might say, for this person, I can enter into starting to change their chi dynamic. They tend to see they're displaying more fire. That's why he would like to treat the symptoms so much, because they're displaying through that. That's the open door. I'm recognizing that with my diagnosis. So, he said, therefore, diagnosis isn't quite as important as it at first seems. We often get so preoccupied with recognizing exactly which syndrome that person is, and it's really like, which syndrome of many choices. Haven't you experienced that clinically? You encounter a person with a particular complaint, and you look in a treatment formulary book, and it says, oh, there's 5 general types underlying that. And when you look at the patient, you say, geez, they look like they have some of all 5. That's generally true. Because, as Dr. Su would say, when the person begins to dysfunction, the body begins, every organ starts to go in its general tendency. People with liver problems, the liver always tends to get hot and stagnant. People with spleen problems, the spleen always gets deficient and cold. The stomach always ends up with some food retention after a while. Just the nature. So inevitably, your system begins to dysfunction. You start to see stuff popping out in all those areas. Now my question with diagnosis is, which one of these many things the person is displaying is the place I can put therapeutic pressure most effectively? So the diagnosis helps me decide that. But the person is, you're sick, you're already, everything's. So now where can I start to unravel this knot of dysfunction? So we said that one aspect of this lesser yang type and important for post-traumatic stress and so forth is this concept of yin fire. Now we can go to our handout pack.